The Spitfire is one of the greatest and most charismatic aircraft ever built. Even today, it never fails to captivate audiences, young and old, with its grace and beauty, perhaps inspiring new generations of youngsters to discover flight. Indeed, one wonders how a thing of such beauty could be an effective killing machine. And yet they were. Spitfires fought in all theatres of the Second World War, from Europe to the Pacific. It performed many roles, as well as that of the traditional fighter, including ground attack, bombing, and photo reconnaissance. In fact, the Spitfire was the only fighter to begin full production before 1939 and still be produced after 1945. Long after its contemporaries were retired, the Spitfire continued to be developed, resulting in 24 different versions. Today, only a few dozen are kept in flying condition, even though over 22,000 were built. The story of the Spitfire begins in the early 1930s. During the years following the end of the First World War, air racing became a popular spectator sport. The premier event was the Schneider Trophy. In 1929, the trophy was won by a team of British Royal Air Force pilots. Their aircraft was a small float plane built by Supermarine. Supermarine had carved out a reputation for building seaplanes that helped make international air travel a reality in the years between the wars. In 1930, Supermarine teamed up with engine builder Rolls-Royce to build another race-winning aircraft. Under the rules of the Schneider Trophy, any country winning 3 times in a row got to keep the trophy in perpetuity. In 1931, Supermarine and Rolls-Royce did it again, setting a new world speed record along the way. The aircraft was designed by Supermarine's chief designer, Reginald Mitchell, and the partnership with Rolls-Royce during the Schneider Trophy years was destined to result in the legendary Spitfire. The early 1930s were turbulent times in Europe. The Nazis, under Adolf Hitler, had seized power in Germany. They began rebuilding their armed forces, despite severe restrictions that had been imposed following the First World War. Under the terms of the 1919 armistice, Germany was forbidden to have an air force. Hitler, gambling on the fact that few European leaders had an appetite for confrontation, authorized the building of a new air force, equipped with the latest monoplane fighters and bombers. In British minds, the bomber was the ultimate terror weapon that rendered all defenses redundant. This was due to the fact that British cities had been bombed by German Zeppelins and Gotha aircraft during the First World War. Recognizing that its fighter defenses were obsolete, the Air Ministry began preparing specifications for a new monoplane fighter. At Supermarine, Mitchell had been using his experience in the design of high-speed aircraft to create a new fighter. The challenge was to house the required 8 guns in the thin wings, which were vital to the design's projected performance. A solution was found by building the elliptical wing, giving the Spitfire to be its legendary shape. Not only could the 8 guns be accommodated, 4 on each side, but it had an extraordinary aerodynamic performance. Power was to be provided by a new engine from Rolls-Royce. Designated the PV-12, it would later be known as the Merlin. But Mitchell's creation was beaten into the air by a competing design from Sidney Cam at Hawker. The Hurricane was a much more conventional design in that it incorporated fabric stretched over a frame, just like many of Hawker's elegant biplanes produced in the 1920s and 30s. But the Hurricane was easy to build, and as was found during the height of the Battle of Britain, it could take an enormous amount of punishment and would always get its pilot home, just so long as no bullets hit the control cables. Mitchell's design, still known as the Type 224, was a very complex aircraft, relying on a stressed metal skin, which, although very light and strong, was difficult to build, particularly under wartime conditions. In March 1936, Type 224 made its maiden flight, with test pilot Mutt Summers at the controls. On landing, he declared that it was perfect. Nothing should be touched. Then in May, the RAF ordered 310 aircraft without waiting for test reports. But where did the Spitfire get its name from? There are many theories. Because its maker, Supermarine, began with an S, it was decided that the new aircraft should follow suit. Many names were considered, including Shrike and Shrew. Fortunately, these were discarded, and from somewhere, its origins lost in time, came the name Spitfire. But just a year after the Spitfire's first flight, and with orders coming in, R.J. Mitchell died after a long fight with cancer. His assistant, Joseph Smith, took over, and it was he who would design all future Marks. In August 1938, the first Mark I Spitfires were delivered to the RAF's No. 19 Squadron based at Duxford, near Cambridge. In Europe, events were heading to war, as Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, sought assurances from Adolf Hitler as to his intentions. By August 1939, some 10 squadrons were now equipped with Spitfires, less than 200 aircraft, of which only 150 were actually ready for battle. The first batch of 77 Spitfire Mark I's had a two-bladed, fixed-pitch propeller. Later deliveries had a three-bladed, two-positioned air screw, with fine pitch for takeoff and coarse pitch for cruising. The first aircraft also had a flat canopy, which taller pilots found very restrictive. This was replaced by a bulged version, which was to become a distinctive feature on future Marks. There were also improvements inside the aircraft. For example, the windscreen was changed to an armoured type, and the pilot also received 6mm armour panels behind his seat and on the rear bulkheads of the engine bay. Another early problem was that the guns tended to freeze at high altitude. The solution was to introduce heating to the 8.303 Browning machine guns. Also, waxed cloth covers were placed over the gun ports to keep them dry until the pilot fired his first burst. Many pilots found the new aircraft difficult to adapt to. For those used to the open cockpits of its predecessors, the Spitfire seemed claustrophobic. Retractable undercarriages were also a new feature in these aircraft, and it was not unknown for pilots to embarrass themselves by forgetting to lower the wheels before landing. Combined with the narrow track and somewhat fragile undercarriage, landing a Spitfire in a crosswind could be hazardous. Similarly, taking off required the pilot to change hands on the stick so that he could raise the undercarriage. The spectacle of a Spitfire porpoising as its inexperienced pilot struggled to raise the undercarriage whilst flying in a straight line became part of Spitfire folklore.
Flying a Spitfire for the first time, my first flight was on a Mark I, on which you had to pump up the undercarriage. So there was a little glamour taken out of when you first got airborne, because having to pump up the undercarriage, you tended to move the stick backwards and forwards, so you went off in a rather undulating manner. But once the undercarriage was up, then it was frightening, exhilarating.
Even taxiing took some getting used to. Although the nose of the aircraft was extremely elegant, the pilot could not see forward. The solution was to zigzag by swinging the tail from side to side. Yet, once pilots had mastered its idiosyncrasies, they came to love the Spitfire.
When you get into a car, you strap yourself in. Well, you're strapped into a car. When you climbed into a Spitfire, you strapped the Spitfire onto you, and you became part of the Spitfire, and the Spitfire became part of you.
But the Spitfire nearly failed to take off at all. The difficulties in building the aircraft meant that there were not nearly enough rolling off the production line. The Air Ministry considered cancelling production. In the end, Supermarine were able to persuade the men from the ministry that things would improve, especially when a new shadow factory was opened at Castle Bromwich in the Midlands. On September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Then on the 3rd, Britain declared war against Germany. On the 6th, Spitfires of 74 Squadron went into action for the first time. But the sortie ended in tragedy when they accidentally shot down 2 Hurricanes from number 56 Squadron. It was not until October the 16th that the first enemy aircraft fell to the Spitfire's guns. 2 Junkers Ju-88s and 2 Heinkel HE-111s were shot down by Spitfires from number 602 and 603 squadrons over the Firth of Forth. But this period was popularly known as the Phony War. Britain faced little in the way of a direct threat, and the Luftwaffe's raids were few and far between. Fighter Command used the time to hone its skills. The tragic shooting down of the Hurricanes led to a greater effort in combining all the different aspects of air defense into a more cohesive whole. It was essential that radar operators, observers, plotters and controllers had accurate and timely information if the system was to work. Little could they have known just how critical this would be as events moved towards the momentous summer of 1940 and what would later be called the Battle of Britain.
As regards the technical defense, like radar and IFF, without those, I don't think the Battle of Britain would have been won, because so many pilots and aircraft would have had to have flown continuous patrols. And I don't think the reserves of either would have supported that type of tactic. So the radar enabled us to be scrambled when actually the aircraft, the enemy were attacking. And the IFF we had enabled the plotters to identify us from the opposition.
In April 1940, the Phony War came to an abrupt end when Germany invaded Norway. The following month, it was the turn of the Low Countries and then France to experience the full wrath of the German blitzkrieg. Although Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, authorized Spitfire squadrons to fly offensive patrols across the Channel, the majority were held back in preparation for the sterner battles to come. It was a far-sighted policy, but it brought the fighter pilots much criticism, especially as the troops waited to be evacuated off the beaches at Dunkirk. Despite this, 67 Spitfires were lost during the Battle of France, which Fighter Command could ill afford.
I don't think we could have done any more than we did. There's a book being read about it, and the main thing is that we were so few. When you remember how far we had to fly, because of our endurance, we didn't have long-range tanks. We could only have perhaps an hour, perhaps less, over there. And to try and keep that up in May, which is sunshine from 5:30 in the morning till, 10, 11 at night, how could we be there all the time?
But valuable lessons had been learned. It was realized that the Luftwaffe's tactical formation of a loose finger four was superior to the RAF's traditional Vic formation of 3 aircraft. Also, guns were harmonized to converge at 250 yards rather than 400. The fuel was changed for a higher octane, which increased the Spitfire speed by a useful 25 miles per hour at sea level and 34 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. With France lost, Britain was on her own. It would be down to the young pilots of Fighter Command to stem the Nazi tide. The Luftwaffe's commander, Hermann Goering, was convinced that he could defeat the RAF within weeks, paving the way for a full amphibious invasion. Officially, the Battle of Britain was fought between July the 10th and October the 31st, 1940. Fighter Command had 27 squadrons of Hurricanes and 19 of Spitfires. Pilots came from all over the world and backgrounds. As the battle unfolded, Fighter Command refined its tactics by ordering the Hurricanes to attack the bombers while the Spitfires went for their fighter escorts.
When I first went into battle, I was on a very steep learning curve. I was learning to fly the aircraft and endeavouring to learn how to shoot. And certainly in my earlier flights, someone would shout on the radio, "Break," that meant we were being attacked. And I broke, a steep turn, left or right. And I found myself completely alone in the sky, not even an enemy aircraft in sight, let alone any of my rest of the squadron. As the war progressed, I'm talking about during the Battle of Britain now, one became more aware. And it was during this period of complete, almost ignorance of not knowing what was happening, to becoming aware, where, of course, you lost the most pilots. If you got over that steep learning curve, you stood a far better chance of survival.
The Spitfire's great adversary was the Messerschmitt Me 109. Both aircraft had very similar performance, with advantages and disadvantages in certain conditions. The Spitfire could turn more tightly and was slightly faster, below 15,000 feet. But the Messerschmitt had superior rate of climb and was marginally faster, above 20,000 feet. Also, the Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine used fuel injection, which meant that it could push negative G at the top of a climb. The Spitfire's Merlin engine had a float-type carburetor, which meant that the pilot had to perform longer maneuvers in order to maintain positive G. Otherwise, the engine would cut out due to fuel starvation.
I've chased a few 109s. I don't know who was most frightened, he or I. But when they were heading for home, they went into a steep dive. With petrol injection, if you attempted, they had petrol injection engines. If with the Spitfire, you attempted to follow them exactly the same way by pushing the stick forward, your engine cut out. And by that time, the Spitfire, the enemy was well away and out of range.
But the Messerschmitt's big disadvantage was a lack of endurance. By the time the bomber formations had formed up and made their way to the English coast, the escorting fighters were running low on fuel, leaving them just a few minutes of combat time before they had to break off and head back to France.
Well, then again, my own experience was that they just dove away. I don't remember having a dogfight that lasted very long. because eventually you'd get on his tail and then he'd dive away, you see. In fact, my experience of generally of 109s is that they always wanted to get away, funnily enough. They didn't want to engage. So you were either caught yourself and didn't have much option, or you had a few moments, or you caught him without being seen, or you got a shot or two and then away you went. And you'd be very lucky if you could, if you're already behind, be able to catch up. I had several occasions, full bore going down, and sometimes occasionally getting a little bit nearer, mostly not being able to.
Although the Luftwaffe had a numerical advantage, fighter commands were